Beating China at its own game, is it just a pipe dream? We enter the geopolitical opium den with Michael Sobolik. I'm James Poulos. Welcome to Zero Hour. Michael Sobolik is a senior fellow in Indo-Pacific Studies at the American Foreign Policy Council. He hosts the Great Power podcast and is also the author of Countering China's Great Game, a strategy for American dominance. Remember that? American dominance?
I do. I hope we can get it back again.
Okay. One does not simply regain global hegemony. So where do we begin?
By going on the offensive, which is what we're decidedly not doing right now. So the premise of the book and the premise of my work since I was in government in the Senate from 2014 to 2019, and the big impression I took away during that time was, on the one hand, America's China policy was decidedly shifting away from unmitigated economic and political engagement with the Chinese Communist Party, which I think was a huge mistake. Mm-hmm. We were starting to take them seriously for the threat they were, and I think that was good. But what Congress and subsequent administrations were doing that I think is incomplete, we were reacting to all of these problems that the CCP had created for America: malign influence, infiltration in our critical institutions, critical infrastructure. We weren't trying to figure out where are Beijing's weaknesses. How do we exploit them and force them to get on their back heels strategically? And that is the most important and most critical thing we have to do first if we're going to get our dominance back as America.
All right, but it can be done.
Absolutely.
All right. What's the time frame? How long is it going to take?
Well, so it's easy to be fatalistic about this for so many reasons, and I understand that. Cold Wars, which is my starting point of assumption that I believe the United States is in another Cold War this time with Beijing. We won the last one, and that one took us how many decades?
Just a few
to win,
right?
So success is going to be measured not in elections, American election cycles. It's going to be measured in decades, just like it was last time.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things, I distinctly remember during my time in DC, one of those breakfasts that you roll into when you're somewhere in your 20s and you've got your cheap tie and your cheap blazer on, and you get served some cheap eggs, and you listen to some guests sort of talking about
some soggy bacon too.
Ostensibly what's going on. I'm pretty sure it was one of the these guys rotate in and out. One of the heads of the GOP, the party organization. And he was getting peppered with questions from disgruntled 20-somethings, some of whom were gasp bloggers and wanted to make a name for themselves. But they were pretty good questions. And one of the questions was, and this was in the context of the war on terror, gosh, this sure does seem to be getting pricey. At what point is it too pricey? And the response was like, well, Ronald Reagan was willing to spend any amount of money in order to beat the Soviets. And that's a debate that I'll take any day because we won it before and we'll win it again. So sure enough, it was a big price tag. And yeah, perhaps, our ability to deficit finance and deficit spend helped, get the edge over the Soviets. We had a more productive economy. It's not that hard to understand, that we did have an advantage there. But, yes, you win. And then what happens? And then you end up paying for it one way or the other. And maybe the next time a crisis comes around, well, how many times can you just spam that deficit spending button and hope that it all works out? Looking at what we're facing with China, looking at the condition that our economy and our financial system is in, do we have that luxury anymore of just saying, what's another trill? It'll all come out in the wash once we win.
We don't have that luxury. And I think if we make the mistake of assuming that we do, this fiscal cliff that we've been cascading toward for a long time now is getting closer than I think a lot of us appreciate.
Yeah.
And we would be foolish, beyond foolish, to ignore that. I think we would also be foolish if we uncritically just ran the same playbook from our Cold War with the Soviets and expected to get the exact same result, because the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China are two different problem sets. Like, sure, they do have a lot of similarities. The Soviet Union was a communist nation. The Chinese Communist Party is literally in the name a Marxist-Leninist organization as well. Now, we can quibble about, are they true believers? Is it the exact same style of communism as the Soviets? No, not exactly.
Yeah.
But that's kind of beside the point, right? Like,
well, my impression is they sort of the prevailing attitude there is, hey, we worked out the kinks. This isn't your grandfather's Marxism, Leninism. China is actually the best suited to figure out how to perfect or optimize collectivism, and we're going to run with it.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Like they've studied the failures of the Soviet Union almost obsessively. Xi Jinping in particular, like he forces all of his comrades and every single member of the CCP, which is at or just around 100 million people, to study why the USSR collapsed, because they don't want to fail again. So when we look at this new Cold War today, what does a plan for victory look like? It's not going to be rerunning the same playbook. The Chinese Communist Party, arguably, like you can make a great case that they have, in the short run, stronger economic advantages than we do. I think in the medium and long term, we have a better outlook, but there's a reason they are winning the competition for economic development in the global south and we're not. But when we ask, where are we strong? Where is Beijing weak? That gets us into the territory of information, which Xi Jinping and China rightly view as the oil of the 21st century, the most valuable commodity out there today. I think we have the edge there when it comes to the CCP's fear of the truth and speech they cannot control. I think that is decidedly to our advantage. We have an advantage in that they are committing an ongoing genocide as part of their biggest foreign policy project in the world. If you need to commit mass atrocities for your pet project to work, you have a strategic problem, one that I think we could exploit in ways we're not. And I also think that their state-owned enterprises that they conduct a lot of foreign policy through are hopelessly corrupt. And those same enterprises that are building bridges in Southeast Asia over here are also building fake islands in the South China Sea over here. And there's a lot of exposure to these critical nodes that if we took seriously and identified with some really deft economic warfare policy that's asymmetric, I think we could put them on their heels and begin to turn the tide.
All right, well, let's start with their game plan, and then we'll kind of pick it apart. So you're Xi, you're feeling pretty good. Chinese are always worried about the return of one of those 400 or so year cycles where everything just melts down. They have their sort of own kind of great reset. They don't want it to happen again. They feel like they're sort of hitting the moment at a good time to expand, really in an unprecedented way for China. A lot of confidence, but also, I think there's an awareness of the seriousness of the stakes, and a real desire to get it right. On the part of the Chinese. A lot of controversy in the West, in the US, over just the simple question of what do they actually want? Do they want global domination? Do they want, the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere? Do they just want to sort of get rich and make sure that everyone gets fed so that the regime isn't overthrown? What do they want?
Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party want to dominate the world. They want to change it. Will maybe even stronger than that. They want to reject and remake the post-World War II and post-Cold War global order that America and our allies built and maintain today. They not only have, I think, a bit of a grudge from how European colonialism impacted China in the 19th century, like the century of humiliation, which a lot of China scholars are quick to point to.
Yeah.
China also has this broader millennia-long heritage of being the Middle Kingdom and having this political philosophy unique to China that the emperor is literally the son of heaven and meant to rule over all under heaven, this concept in Mandarin called tianxia. And that strategic culture did not disappear when Mao Zedong established the PRC in 1949. And I think a lot of American, I'm not just China scholars, but even American politicians who deal with national security every day, we tend to assume that history started around the time the Second World War ended, which coincidentally was also when we emerged as one of the most dominant nations in the world.
Yeah.
And it's easy for Americans, I think, to believe over time that it's always been this way.
Yeah.
We have always been the most dominant and the strongest. But if you look at, speaking of the East Asia co-prosperity sphere that you mentioned, if you go back well past 1776 and go back to the time of Christ, when the Han Dynasty was the second fully unified dynasty to govern China, they were expanding into westwards into Central Asia and southern to the south down into Vietnam. And if you fast forward through China's dynastic history, which I did a lot of when I was writing this book, on average, dynastic China never knew a year without war. It expanded by a factor of 4 from the first dynasty to the last, which is a remarkable story that a lot of American politicians who wanted to engage China tried to downplay, like Henry Kissinger, tried to downplay and ignore because it complicated the gamble and the bet they were making that we can tame these guys, that we can civilize them or modernize them.
In order to split the communists.
That was the initial gambit, correct.
Yeah.
And listen, geopolitics and realpolitik is a part of foreign policy. To deny it would be to just be hopelessly naive. And I appreciate the strategic vision that Nixon and Kissinger had, because theoretically, you can see how it's a clever play, because Moscow and Beijing hated each other.
Oh, yeah.
In the middle
Skirmishes
of the Cold War.
across the border, all kinds of stuff.
They almost came to nuclear blows. Almost. And I understand the desire to drive the wedge in there, but the mistake we made along the way was, what price are we willing to pay to do that? Number one. And number two, does China need us more, or do we need China more? And the folks in the Kissinger camp always believed we needed China so much, even beyond the Soviet Union. Like when we won the Cold War, Nixon and George H.W. Bush and that crowd valued the China relationship so much that they weakened our stance on other important factors like Taiwan, which is a huge reality today. Like if you see all the headlines about Taiwan, you can start to see some storm clouds coming over the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah.
And the original sin, one of the original sins of our China policy was in 1972 when, in secret, decidedly not in public, Henry Kissinger promised Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong that the United States recognized that Taiwan was a part of China, which is not what we said publicly. And that fundamental calculation that China matters more to America than Taiwan was a huge slap to the credibility of the United States with our allies and our partners. And if you look at the congressional debate in the wake of switching diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China, Congress rightfully has always been the defender of Taiwan, because they realize if we lose Taiwan, not only do we lose our credibility, that puts China, which is an imperial power historically, on the momentum that they have other border disputes with other countries.
You know, when I think about the Chinese, as you said, obsessively revisiting the fall of the USSR,
Yes.
and of course not wanting, wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, what the Russians had to go through there. They didn't deserve it. It was really bad. I wonder, though, you talk to a lot of Americans today, and they say being the world's policeman sucks. Trying to go around the world and take care of all these problems, it just hasn't worked. We won, and within 10, 15 years, we were the loser, and we're still losing. And it's not as easy as just, we'll retreat 200 yards back to that hill and build defensive fortifications. Like, you can't just slowly find a more defensible posture in that kind of easy way when you're a global hegemon. It's almost an all or nothing proposition. And a lot of Americans right now, they don't want another war. They don't want more hardship. They want to somehow, get these tentacles of world domination pulled out of the body politic. So I wonder, if in a sense is China looking at the wrong collapsing empire? Doesn't China look at the U.S. situation and say, wow, global domination, that seems like more of a curse than a blessing?
Let's start with the United States first, and then we can look at China. So any American who has this sense of, I just don't know if I trust the elected officials to even win a Cold War, and
or the unelected officials,
or the unelected officials, which we can talk about the State Department all day there. Those concerns, I think, are evidence that we have the antibodies that we need in our democratic system right now. Like, if we didn't have those questions, I would be concerned. Mm-hmm. Let's be real. America made some disastrous strategic mistakes and miscalculations in the wake of September 11th, 2001. We thought that democracy was not only a universal value, but was also universally valued by everybody. We thought we just had to topple these regimes and the rest of it would kind of take care of itself. And I think America was humbled in those years in Afghanistan and Iraq. And rightly so. I think it was in some ways the height of hubris for us to expect that we could remake these nations in the Middle East, Jeffersonian democracies.
Where do you think that came from, that arrogance?
I think in part, at least in part, if you go back to 1994, there is this seminal essay that was published in the National Interest magazine mm-hmm. by a scholar named Francis Fukuyama. Mm-hmm. And the title of it was The End of History, ? And
question mark. Forgotten today.
So his thesis, which was, I think, really captured the zeitgeist of this post-Cold War victory, mm-hmm. was, we not only beat the Soviets, democracy beat every other system out there. Mm-hmm. We won. And this inexorable move away from these illiberal philosophies towards this, in some ways, a utopian world and a utopian future of democracy's advance was intoxicating. And at one level, I get it. Like, America in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, I think you could argue was the most powerful nation in the history of human existence. I think hyperpower is a better word than superpower. Mm-hmm. And listen, like, if you are the local drunk in any city, you tend to document your delusions around town because you can't control yourself. America documented our delusions very publicly as well. Like, if you read our security documents during the Clinton administration, they were saying explicitly there is no trade-off between our economic security and our national security. Mm-hmm. We can have free trade, unmitigated free trade, and unmitigated security. Mm-hmm. That's proven today, I think, very convincingly to be Pollyannish fiction.
Well, it's interesting because, what's the logic there? Like, if you wanted to build some kind of institutional system that could plausibly reconcile or unify free trade and national security, what would you build? Well, you'd build corporate globalization, right? You'd build these like deep public-private partnerships between centralized corporate financial and economic power and, what some call the deep state, right? Your military intelligence complex, defense contractors. You would need to just continuously push into parts of the globe where those institutions didn't have reach. I mean, I think of Mitt Romney, who said, like, we need to modernize the Mideast. That's what they need, modernization. And I thought at the time, and I think even more now, didn't modernization sort of get us into this mess? And so that's what we got. And so I think you're right in your analysis, but when you look at the way that the rhetoric was cast
yes.
over the globe,
yes.
what was that rhetoric about democratization concealing? And what it was concealing was there's a financial and economic system here that is being created and that is being designed for a new kind of world domination.
So to pick up on that word modernization, go to September 19th, 2000. Then Senator Joe Biden walks down to the floor of the United States Senate, and he gives a speech in defense of extending permanent normal trade relations to the People's Republic of China. What was his rationale for doing so? The the public rationale he gave, I find absolutely fascinating and indicative of this whole conversation. He talked about the search for a modern China, this desire to bring what I think a lot of American elites would call the uncivilized parts of the world into an American-defined modernity. Listen, I am in favor of helping any nation, insofar as we can, that we are friendly with, to be stable and prosperous, insofar as it is judicious and prudent for Americans to do so. I also think it is culturally naive to think that we could even begin to remake another civilization in our own image. And I think that concealed, in large part, to your point, what the American Chamber of Commerce wanted to happen in China. They wanted their businesses to be able to go gangbusters in the PRC. And we got a taste of it in the late 80s and the 90s, and they were chomping at the bit for more. And once these American commercial giants were able to access the People's Republic of China, that was, over the next 20 years, the defining factor and the defining interest group of America's China policy. Everything was secondary, from human rights to security concerns to theft of intellectual property.
Yeah.
Everything was secondary to the interests of Microsoft, Qualcomm, Apple. Name your company, pick your corporation. They were in the driver's seat, and it was decidedly against the foreign policy and national security interests of Americans. But the incentive was not only to maximize profit, the incentive was also to want to believe so badly that we lived in this positive sum world where even with a communist regime like the CCP, we can still have peace and we can still have all of the financial benefits from engaging with them. We wanted to believe it so badly.
Well, and meanwhile, China was having their own experience, their own taste of riches. China's been concerned for a long time about immorality, amorality among the people, you know, sort of cutting in line, not picking up the wall. It's just taking the wallet home if you find it on the street, stepping over the dead bodies, you know, after a car crash. That, I think, is a lot of where that whole sort of what's described as a social credit system came from, this fear of, like, you know, if we have this much prosperity coming in, we really have to sort of up the morality and so the sort of civic sensibility, or else we're going to have some problems. But you fast forward to now, and, you know, China's got its issues, but they seem to have kind of stabilized the political economy. It's weeded out the opponents of the Xi regime, did the crackdowns during COVID, busted up some people in Shanghai, did all that thing. And then meanwhile, you look at what's been going on in the U.S., and it's not been a very pretty financial and economic picture. So how much of the failings of our international financial and economic system can we lay at the feet of the Chinese, and how much is that really our own problem, even without regard to China's rise?
I think Americans should start by looking in the mirror. You know, like, I think it's passing the buck to try to put everything at the feet of our competitors and our adversaries. We have nobody but ourselves to hold accountable for the mistakes we've made. Yeah, I mean, the Chinese Communist Party, whether you want to pick Deng Xiaoping or Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao, or like anywhere in between Mao and Xi Jinping, like, it's not their fault that we bought into this fiction. We told ourselves this story. And if America is going to get out of it, the CCP isn't going to help us. It has to start here. And I do think, though, that one thing we have in our favor, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party have a rough trajectory of their own to deal with. Their long-term economic and demographic trends are horrendous, absolutely horrendous. And Xi's pet foreign policy project, the Belt and Road Initiative, which my book centers on decidedly, has not been the saving grace that he really needed it to be. The social credit system that you brought up, I think, is really illustrative, because as China became wealthy in the late 80s into the 90s and the 2000s, The CCP did what every totalitarian regime does. They said instinctively, we need to find a way to control this new economic reality so it doesn't translate into a new political call for freedom. Mm-hmm. They knew they had to control it if they wanted to stay alive. And the social credit system was part of this broader ecosystem of a political response that you are growing more wealthy if you are a Chinese person, but you must remember your place. You must never question the wisdom of the single party rule and dictatorship of the CCP. And part of it was the social credit system. Part of it was we talked about American corporate giants. China has their own. They're called Alibaba, Hikvision, Dahua, Hytera, video surveillance companies that in a way that no other company in the world can operate in parts of China as an all-seeing eye, particularly in regions like Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are, that are the victims of a genocide. And I think that is illustrative of a regime that is insecure and fearful. And if we can find a way to tap into those fears, I think we have some asymmetric strong points of ours that we can exploit.
Even with our financial and economic situation trending downward.
Yes. So this is key. I'm glad you brought this up. To circle back to this really critical question you asked a minute or two ago, can we win a Cold War if we are in this precarious and difficult economic reality we are in now that we were not in during the 80s? I say yes because the goal this time is not to outspin the CCP. We did that with the Soviets. We had the ability to do so, and we did it cleverly. Not just by saying, pedal to the metal, we're going to up DoD funding across the board. Like, to an extent, yeah, we did, but we also competed in very discreet ways. We noticed that they were really fearful of strategic bombing, and they thought that we had better missile defenses than we actually did. And we ran deception campaigns on both of those tracks and got them to make bad defense investments of their own. When we talk about asymmetric competition, that is the vibe we need to get in. It's not necessarily having gangbusters, irresponsible spending. Although I think if we're going to defend Taiwan, we are going to need to spend some more on our Navy and our Air Force. I think that is unavoidable. But when we talk about competing asymmetrically, that means competing efficiently. You don't need to have crazy defense spending or national security investments to get the CCP to get on their back heels and to be on the defensive. So in the last two chapters of my book are identifying where China is weak geopolitically and laying out specific initiatives that we can do at fairly low cost to play with their deepest political fears and insecurities.
So this is fascinating because what you're giving me is really the opposite of what we're getting out of the Biden administration right now, as far as I can tell, in the sense of the prevailing attitude right now seems to be, okay, we're gonna not try to beat them in head-to-head competition on economics or finance or even military. What we're going to do is we're going to beat them on AI. Everything is going to come down to AI. We can kind of ignore all of the monsters under the bed if we just floor the pedal on AI, whatever it costs, however much energy it consumes. As long as we beat them here, we'll beat them everywhere. Seems like you don't believe that.
I wish it were that simple. I really wish it were that simple. I mean, the Biden administration, I think, is hopelessly self-contradictory because on the one hand, they want to beat China in AI, and on the other hand, they want to have a working group to cooperate with China in AI. The internal contradictions of the Biden administration, I think, is indicative of how they're caught between so many different interest groups. Yeah. Like you have the climate change lobby and the progressive left that doesn't want to do anything to hold the CCP accountable for the Uyghur genocide because of the solar panels that are produced in Xinjiang with slave labor, or the electric battery supply chain that runs through China and Xinjiang specifically. You have very wealthy left of center donors who are also in academia. And academia has very significant and deep funding exchanges with Chinese counterparts. It's in their interest to have less sunlight on the types of research they're collaborating with inside of China, some of which is related to matters of national security that no American entity should be funding or contributing to. So it's a broad problem. And I think it also is indicative of not wanting to believe or admit that we're in a Cold War, but also not wanting to admit that everything is hunky-dory either. And there, I see no presidential leadership or courage there. Like, you have to be clear. Is this a positive-sum world where we can all get along to go along, or is this a zero-sum Cold War? And Xi Jinping has already made his decision. We do not have the luxury of having our cake and eating it too with national security if your adversary does not allow you to have it.
Yeah, I want to return to this zero-sum question in a minute. But before we get there, if you're a right-winger in America right now who's tuned into any of this stuff, your attitude is basically the administration is the evil empire. This is a Borg. The left is in lockstep. There's no dissent. They stamped out all of the anti-corporate, anti-deep state, Bernie people. They're toast. It's a totally unified and consolidated power structure. And if Trump doesn't come back, we're toast. I understand why people have that attitude, but I do think it is a little more complicated in the way that you're describing, where there's some real dramatic cleavages. We might not be able to see them very well, but they're in there in the administration. And some of that is just a reflection of, 25 years of strategic whiffs or worse. It starts to pile up. And so it's clear that there's a faction in DC on the left that wants to just floor it on AI and beat the Chinese.
Yes.
But there's also another faction that still wants globalization and still thinks that America can only survive if it controls globalization. And you can't have globalization without Chimerica. You just have to somehow merge these two hyperpowers into one socioeconomic system of some kind. No matter if you're talking a 20-year, 200-year time frame, you got to be pushing in that direction. And so I think, this is what accounts for some of this schizophrenia or this contradictory attitude. I mean, how many times have we been executing the Asia pivot? This has been going on for a while. And there's this tug, there's this pull between, well, we got to beat the Chinese. Well, we can't beat the Chinese unless we become the Chinese. Well, but actually we do want to become the Chinese, because if we don't have globalization, then what does America even mean anymore?
I find that critique of you can't beat China by becoming like China. Like, listen, to a point, yes, I understand it. But I heard a lot of people saying that when Congress was legislating on TikTok not that long ago. And TikTok, by my estimate, was the CCP's greatest weapon targeting American democracy, the most dangerous and the most potent. And it is one thing for China to ban Twitter inside of their own borders because they're afraid of free speech. It is an entirely different thing for the United States to force the divestment of a company from a Chinese parent company because the CCP controls one of the biggest online fora in America. Those are not the same thing. So I think it is very important for Americans to be clear and to have to have a very healthy sense of self-respect for, again, listen, like, for all of the issues we have in our own country domestically, we're still the United States, and the CCP is still a Leninist authoritarian regime. Two qualitatively different things. And I think America needs to stand up for what we hold most valuable if we're going to win. Taking care of TikTok was, in my judgment, a huge test of our seriousness in this Cold War. That we passed it is encouraging, but it's also the bare minimum, right?
Right. Now
it's the absolute bare minimum. Going on the offense is next. Like, taking care of our business at home, you don't get a gold star in Cold Wars for taking care of your homeland. Like, good defense might win NBA championships. Like that cliche that for anyone who watches basketball, like you've heard that growing up. Good defense produces good offense, and you win championships with that. In great power competition, good defense is box checking. You are not a serious country if you don't do it. It takes political will to win a Cold War. And that means you need to have a clearly defined vision of what victory looks like, and then you need to pursue it to win.
Right. So this is related to the zero-sum issue.
Yes.
Because, you talk about Americans with no concept of historical or cosmological time before 1945. And okay, even if you push it back to, the other kind of break point, which is 1865, Americans have it in their head, and I think this goes all the way to the top in many cases, that the only kind of victory is unconditional victory. That the only way that America can win a conflict is by just completely reducing the other guy to a state of abject defeat. We saw it with the Cold War. We saw it with World War II. We saw it with the Civil War. Didn't happen in World War I, but, look what happened. World War I just rolled over into World War II. We tried for sort of limited objectives in Vietnam, and that really sucked. So, we tried for limited objectives in Korea. That really sucked. If only MacArthur had been able to bomb the Yalu, then, unconditional surrender, right? There is this kind of theme that's been running through American life, and it is associated with a certain kind of, you're not a real patriot. If you only want to kind of win, you have to totally win. We didn't achieve manifest destiny. We didn't conquer the West until we, left the Indians with nothing. So there is this attitude.
There is.
And when you're looking at great power competition, there is this attitude right now among a lot of China hawks, which is, it's not just about making sure that the dashes are, this side of this atoll or that side of that atoll. It's not just a matter of making sure that, if someone's going to trans the kids and brainwash them using the social media apps, it's going to be an American company, gosh darn it, not a Chinese company. We have to take down the CCP. We have to crush the regime. It's starting to look like Saddam Hussein all over again. That seems to me like not realistic. However, there is still this question of like, okay, well, where do you draw the line? How do you know what counts as victory? Is it really zero sum? Do we really need to wipe out communism in China? How do we know what victory looks like?
Sure. So I think a starting point is asking, what does victory look like for the CCP? And then having clarity on that can help us better define what victory looks like for us. So Xi Jinping is not Adolf Hitler. The goal is not territorial conquest of the globe. That said, the PRC does have territorial ambitions beyond Taiwan. Separate conversation, though.
They need that farmland.
True. They do. Big population, lots of food. Xi Jinping is out for political domination. The Chinese Communist Party is happy to cede the sovereignty of a piece of land to another government as long as they know who they bow the knee to. And this is very indicative of the tribute system of old during dynastic China, right?
Classic imperial politics.
Classic imperialism. And Xi Jinping is not just looking at his near abroad with that view in mind. The scope is global. The scope is global. When he talks about the China dream and rejuvenating the Chinese nation, it starts with annexing Taiwan by war if necessary, but it encompasses the entire globe in what they call a community of common destiny for all mankind, which is kind of Orwellian. And if you
sounds like communism.
It is basically communism. And if you want to go deeper into that, I have a good friend at the Naval War College named Ian Easton who wrote about how it is actually communism, and it's terrifying. But what does that mean for America? Americans who live in Dallas or Des Moines or Columbia, or pick your town or your city, we go about our lives existing, taking care of our families, putting our kids through school, getting food on the table, making sure the errands are run on time, that we're staying under budget if we can. We do not live our lives with this realization that we stand in the way of authoritarian impulses. Yet we do. And I think that self-consciousness, can be shocking to Americans, because no American is out looking for global domination or to change the world. We want a safe, stable democracy at home. We want to take care of our friends and our allies. And we want to have economic policies that make sense for American families and for American citizens. Yet, because of what America is and what it stands for, our global influence today does, by its very existence, threaten the CCP. They view us as a critique to the propaganda they tell their own people, which is that democracy and freedom is what we say it is. We get to define what that means. And that is why they are looking not just to weaken our influence inside of their own borders, they are weakening our democracy inside of our own borders. That starting point, I think, needs to be front of center when we ask, what are our objectives? The bare minimum is to protect our most valuable crown jewels and assets, which is our political system, from foreign interference. But it has to go beyond that because Beijing's scope, again, is global. I think it's a mistake to run the Afghanistan-Iraq play all over again. The good news is we can win a Cold War without collapsing the regime. I think we need to go on the offensive and not be afraid to exploit the vulnerabilities that would make the CCP politically unstable. But we can do that in calculated ways without actually intending or trying to collapse the CCP and rebuild something new inside of Zhongnanhai and Tiananmen Square. Like that would be the height of irresponsibility because nobody knows what's going to come next, right? But the goal should be to weaken the regime at home, to force them to turn inward instead of expand outward.
So the world is big enough for the both of us.
No, I don't think it is. I wish it were. It's big enough.
Well,
let me put it this way.
You talked to Vladimir Putin, and he's been on this kick recently where he's like, look, we've had our problems with the Chinese. Asia seems like a big continent to you maybe, but we're two big countries and we've found a way to get along. Rodney King thought, right? Can't we all just get along?
Yeah.
Like maybe you guys should try to just find a way to share the globe.
We can share the globe if the CCP is too weak with problems at home to be strong abroad.
Well, this is exactly what they're most paranoid about, though,
exactly.
Right? Because they know that if they start getting a little weak, history suggests that the regime is not long for this world.
That's right. And this is where America needs to calibrate very carefully our competitive posture. Our goal should be to weaken them and to turn them inward, which is incidentally what they're trying to do to us as well.
Well, they have a theory on this, which I think, I don't agree with this, but I think this is their strongest argument, which I've seen coming out of some of the better tech people in China. And what they say is, look, the West can't handle digital technology. It's driving them insane. And it's driving them insane because they have this deep-seated philosophical dualism. All the way back to the ancient Greeks, it's this mind-body dualism. It's like soul or spirit, psyche, and body, the physical and the immaterial. And these two things are in tension, they're in conflict, they're pulling in different directions. There's no harmony. And we, the Chinese, understand that these two are actually one and they're harmonious. And we have 4,000 plus years of understanding how the spiritual and the immaterial, the spirit and the body actually can only function together in this kind of harmony. And because we have that understanding, we can deal with supreme technological acceleration in a way that doesn't drive us crazy. Unlike those Westerners who they have these crazy religions, they have these visions, their imagination is out of control, and they have this dualism, and it leads to perpetual conflict and internal disorder. And the Chinese, at least, this crowd, they tend to think that Taoism is really compatible with sort of Chinese AI and everything. They think that they're just fundamentally going to be more stable and more secure in a new way because of how technology has advanced, and that for us, it's just gonna it's gonna result in basically increased division, increased insanity, more dysmorphia, more dysgenic activity.
Listen, the critique of Western philosophy with body and mind, I think is a fair one. I think it's a fair one. I would also say, though, that not all of America is very online. The folks who are very online make it appear as though everyone in America is, but not everybody is. And listen, my wife and I and our son, we live just outside of Washington, D.C., and I know that you spent time up there as well, significant time, and everything feels very online when you're in the epicenter of this stuff.
Yeah.
But I take comfort, number one, in the reality that most Americans touch grass daily. But secondly, that not all Americans subscribe to that dualist mindset or ideology. It's not as big as China, but America's a big country. And I am comforted by the fact that, just for myself, one of the best parts of America is our Judeo-Christian heritage, I would put forth. And one of the key tenets of Christianity is a rejection of that body-mind dualism, this understanding that we are one created being, that we are connected and made in the image of our Creator,
who is the physician of our souls and our bodies.
Everything. Yeah. There's no dualism in that mindset. And on the one hand, maybe for someone watching this, like, whoa, we went from great power competition to Christianity. But listen, everything's connected. Yeah. I'm a firm believer that when you are talking about a body politic, civic life, the biggest questions of existence, these things matter, and they are interconnected to each other. And the Chinese Communist Party can say all they want to say about how Taoism is their inoculation against the woes of social media. I would say, though, that they had their own issues of political stability over time. And it's no accident that when I was doing the research for this book, I was not just looking at one or two dynasties. The Qing, the Han, the Sui, the Tang, the Song, the Yuan, the Ming, and the Qing, not to mention smaller dynasties interwoven in there. China has a tumultuous political history, a lot of rises and a lot of falls.
A lot of massacres.
Lots of massacres, lots of untold blood spilt that I think would be difficult for Americans to fathom. Like, yes, we had
millions and millions.
Millions, like beyond the scope of what we would feel would be normal.
Yeah.
It's normal for them in their story, in their history. So, but this presupposes other really big questions. Like, if we are to inoculate ourselves and instead of turning against each other as Americans to see like the external threat that the CCP is, how do we do that? Part of it is leaning on the best, I think, most stable facets of what makes America America, or I would say our Judeo-Christian heritage on the one hand. And on the other hand, too, Democrats and Republicans, like those China hawks on the left that you mentioned a few minutes ago, I've seen this behind closed doors and publicly, but we need more of this. We need Republicans and Democrats who are willing to sacrifice short-term partisan wins to get longer-term progress on China. And that's going to require a lot of trust between members of Congress on opposite sides of the aisle. I've been in DC long enough and I've convened enough of these off-the-record dinners long enough that I see it happening, but we are going to need more.
It sounds like, at least with regard to China, you don't think the world's going to end if Biden comes back in for another term. Sounds like you haven't given up on the administration.
Not at all.
Last question, just got a few minutes. Have to ask, if it's Trump, do you think that there's going to be a real opportunity to get this right?
His first administration gets all of the credit in the entire world for shifting us to a competitive stance with the CCP.
Yeah, really broke the seal.
They broke the seal, they broke the ceiling, particularly in 2020. The biggest question that Donald Trump will have to face is Taiwan. And in a scoop that a Washington Post columnist got from a 2018 Oval Office conversation between Trump and an unnamed GOP senator, Trump said, if they invade Taiwan, there's not a expletive thing we're going to be able to do about it. Trump is mercurial. He changes daily, hourly sometimes. But he will need to find a way to do what Biden failed to do with Putin, which is to make sure that she never decides that it's a good day to invade another country. He's going to have to figure out a way to do it.
All right. On that note, Michael Sobolik, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
That's all the time we got, at least until next time around. So if you're watching YouTube, give us a like, give us a subscribe, comment below. Who would you like to see me interview next? Until that time, this is Zero Hour. I'm James Poulos, and may God have mercy on us all.